Good evening. Can all of you hear me? I'm delighted to welcome you to this teaching event tonight. My name is Ed Miller. I'm a professor in the history department. I'm joined up here tonight by my colleagues, Julia Rabig and Annelise Orleck. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this teach-in event. This event is sponsored by our department, the Department of History, and it's part of our ongoing response to the recent events on Dartmouth's campus, and especially the events on the Green on the night of May 1st. Our department's response to these events began last week in the immediate aftermath of those events when we drafted a collective statement. That statement has been published on the history department's website, so you can go check it out and see what we had to say then. The mass arrests of Dartmouth students, faculty, staff, and other community members on May 1st have raised all kinds of really pressing questions about protest, dissent, free speech, and leadership at Dartmouth over the last 10 days. Our event tonight aims to contribute to these conversations about these important questions, these conversations that are already taking place and are going to continue. I have a couple of things to say about the format for tonight's event. First of all, as I've already mentioned, this is a teach-in. Teach-in, as many of you know, is both a form of activism and an educational event. It is all about learning. Our approach tonight is historical. All three of us are historians. And as all the history students here know, history is not just about studying past events. As historians, we study past events to think about and learn about the relationship of the past to the present and to better understand the present moment and the present context in which we find ourselves. So this is very much a historical event as well. Finally, this is a community building event. If ever our community was in need of building and rebuilding and lifting up, it is right now. And we hope this event will contribute to that. And in connection with that, everyone, all members of our community are welcome here tonight, and all viewpoints are welcome as well. With regards to housekeeping, a couple of things that I need to say at the outset. First of all, we need to express our thanks to the history department administrators, Brooke Lehman, who's here tonight, and Megan Yo, who's not here. This event would definitely not be happening without them. I need to inform you that this event is being recorded and it will be made available on YouTube at some point as soon as possible after the event concludes. The format that we have set up for you tonight is each of us is going to make a presentation during the first part of the evening. And then we are going to move to question and answer and discussion. We really want to be able to hear from and interact with all of you. We do have some people who are connecting to this event via Zoom tonight. And for those of you who are watching on Zoom, we want you to know that we want you to participate as well. You are able to submit questions, and our staff will do their very best to get those questions to us when we get to the Q&A portion of the evening. In just a minute, I'm going to ask Julia to come up and give our first presentation. But before we do that, I think it's really important to acknowledge that here tonight, we have many of the students who were present on the Green last Wednesday evening, including many of the students who were arrested for exercising their right to protest. And so I just want to acknowledge those students among us and say, we're supporting you, and this event is in no small part for you. So thank you for the courage and the bravery that you've shown. All of the students who were there have already shown bravery, and I want to give them a chance to be brave again and ask if there are any of the students who are present on the Green who would like to say something here at the outset before we pointy-headed academics dive into our presentation. Is there anyone who would like to speak now? You will have other opportunities to speak tonight.
welcome your thoughts and emotions. We're all having a lot of emotions right now.
Very much so. Okay. Well, why don't we then let me turn things over to Julia, and we'll go through our presentations in order.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Well, I want to echo Ed's thanks to the history department and to Brooke and Megan, who helped out and made in indispensable ways to make this happen. And I also wanted to thank Morgan Swan, one of the archivists at Runner, who helped me with some last minute research for this presentation. So what I want to do today is to compare two events in 1963 and 1967 when the Alabama Governor George Wallace came to visit Dartmouth. And these were events that took place under the presidency of John Sloan Dickey. And I want to focus on how and why students were protesting and the reaction of the administration to demonstrate how social movements were changing in the mid-1960s and how the student body and the administration both experienced this and also learned from a very divisive moment in U.S. history. So George Wallace, as some of you may know, was the pro-segregationist governor of Alabama. There's a picture of him at the Republican National Convention in 1964, speaking in front of a Confederate flag in support of Barry Goldwater. And Wallace was the governor who sort of famously or notoriously, when he was inaugurated, said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And in June of 1963, he literally stood in the entrance of the University of Alabama to prevent that school's integration. Here's a picture of him saying his piece while the Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach watches on disapprovingly. After the speech, the National Guard moved in to forcibly desegregate the University of Alabama. So when Wallace came in 1967, 4 years later after this, he was visiting in the run-up to the 1968 election when he was considering running for president, which he eventually did. He ran against the Democrat Hubert Humphrey, the Republican Richard Nixon, in the American Independence Party. Convey the considering running for office, and that's part of the reason that some students were interested in having him come to Dartmouth and why he was such a polarizing figure as they sort of turned against the civil rights movement. So I want to talk about the context of this first visit. So only a few years before, in 1960, a picture of some of the first students arrested for sitting in at a Woolworths counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. These were students from Greensboro A&T. And when students sat in to try to desegregate public accommodations in diners and restaurants and lunch counters, they were jeered, they were spit at, food was thrown at them, they were arrested, they were beaten, and yet the sit-ins kept going. And over the 1960 and 1961, historians estimate that 70,000 people participated in sit-ins across the South, and thousands of those people were arrested, many of them were beaten in the process. Out of the sit-ins came a really important organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, otherwise known by the acronym SNCC. And SNCC recruited students from across the country, from campuses, to come to the South and participate in the civil rights movement, in voter registration and political organizing and that sort of thing. Now, I want to sort of pause for a second and talk about this term outside agitators that we've been hearing a lot about, right? We've been hearing about them in the protests that we've seen unfolding. I mean, recently, the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, tried to put a euphemistic spin on this. He talked about external actors who had come in and, in his words, co-opted the protests of Columbia University students. So the term outside agitators has a long history across the 20th century. It was used against communists and perceived communists who were organizing labor unions in the South. It was used against civil rights activists. And what we see is that some white people blamed what they called outside agitators to dismiss activism that was happening in their own midst. So the argument went something like, well, the Black people that live in our community are satisfied with the status quo, right? So people using this, they couldn't imagine that Black people in their communities were independent political actors unless they were being sort of radicalized and riled up by people coming in from the outside. So given this history, we want to be very critical, right, of the way the term outside agitator is deployed to criminalize and to dismiss protests, right? That's kind of an important lesson we might learn from history. At the same time, if we step back and kind of look at this from the perspective of sort of social movement theory, outside agitators, external actors, whatever you want to call them, are key to the linking of small local protests and national movements, right? In some ways, it's impossible to imagine social movements without outside agitators. And Dartmouth students were themselves playing that role sometimes. So one example comes from 1965. A student named John Lutkus, who published a letter to the editor in the D, and he had been a member of the Dartmouth Christian Union here. The Dartmouth Christian Union was a place with a lot of sort of civil rights activism sort of percolating in the early 60s. And Lutkus went south to Selma, Alabama with SNCC, where he worked on voter registration drives. And he was arrested several times. He met Martin Luther King in prison, and he wrote to the D about his experiences. And he talked about how he felt the sense of awe and respect he felt for the students that he had seen repeatedly beaten by police and arrested, who came back again and again to keep this protest going. So that's kind of one example of how, you know, Dartmouth students kind of played this outside agitator role in the movement. So having laid out some of that early 60s history, I want to return more immediately to the context of 1963. So Wallace comes in November of 1963. 6 months earlier, in May, Martin Luther King, who we can think of as sort of the ultimate outside agitator, leads a protest to desegregate Birmingham, Alabama. And this is the protest that produced Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which you may all have read in high school, right? It's one of those kind of canonical texts. And it was the protest with the Children's Crusade, where high school students and some of this protest. And in response to that, the police commissioner of Birmingham, a man named Eugene Bull Connor, released dogs, and he aimed fire. Think about some of the iconic images of the civil rights movement. It's the photographs from Birmingham that went all over the world and sort of called out the U.S.'s position as a beacon of freedom in the Cold War.
Specifically at the two men who were president of Dartmouth during the Vietnam era, John Sloan Dickey and John Kennedy. As we'll see, these leaders were similar in some respects, but in times of crisis, when responding to protests, they did take different approaches. And I think the different approaches are useful for us to think about, especially when thinking about the contemporary crisis we're in right now. I do need to give you some background contextual information. I can't possibly explain what the Vietnam War was, although I will mention that I am teaching History 26 on the Vietnam War in the fall term at the 2 hours, so you should consider adding that course. The U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, as we will learn in History 26, began in the 1950s. But for Dartmouth, the Vietnam War really began in 1965, because it was in that year that Lyndon Johnson launched a massive direct military intervention, U.S. military intervention, on behalf of the anti-communist state of South Vietnam against communist-led North Vietnam. Johnson sent hundreds of thousands of U.S. ground troops to South Vietnam. He also launched a strategic bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The U.S. bombed North Vietnam on pretty much a daily basis for about 3.5 years, from 1965 to 1968. The war very quickly became controversial in the United States. There were lots of Americans who supported Johnson and his actions, which he said were a response to communist aggression. But there were many other Americans who came to question these justifications, began to express opposition to the war, especially as the 1960s wore on. There were a lot of reasons for this opposition. One was the bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Many Americans viewed this as a disproportionate and immoral use of military force by the world's richest and most powerful country against a much smaller, poorer, and weaker country. Another really important reason here was American casualties. The Vietnam War turned out to be a really big war, and by some measures, by the number of Americans who served in the war, it's actually the second largest war in American history after only World War II. And as you can see from this chart here, the number of Americans rose very quickly after 1965, the number of Americans fighting in Vietnam. And not surprisingly, the number of casualties was also rising. Those are per year casualties. So just in the year 1967, there were over 11,000 Americans killed in Vietnam. And as the body bags began to come back, many Americans had more and more questions about this war. Another really important reason for the growing opposition was the U.S. military draft. During the 1950s and early 1960s, American men served in the U.S. military at a very high rate because the draft had been reinstated in 1948. This is actually very anomalous in American history. Prior to the Cold War era, the U.S. Government had only instituted conscription in times of major wars, the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. But starting in 1948, you had this open-ended, more or less permanent draft. Many American men, as a result of this, just assumed that at some point after they turned 18, they would be serving in the military. Either they would serve right after high school, or if they went to college, they could defer their service until after they graduated. But what this meant was, starting in 1965, millions of American men suddenly faced the very real possibility, not just of having to serve in the military, but the chance that they would actually be sent to fight in Vietnam. So for all these reasons, the Vietnam War really becomes very controversial very quickly. And it becomes controversial not just in the United States, but also at Dartmouth. Like most Americans in the 1960s, Dartmouth students were divided over the Vietnam War. There were some students who supported the war and defended Johnson's decisions to wage it. But there were other Dartmouth students who were unsure about the wisdom of the war, but still felt they had a patriotic duty to serve and support it. And then there were growing numbers of students who began to question the war, to oppose U.S. involvement in it, and to protest and to demonstrate their opposition. So by the late 60s, there was a lot of anti-war activism taking place. Some of it took place off campus, but there were also growing numbers of protests on campus. By 1967, there were weekly protests on the Green. Every Wednesday at noon, anti-war students would gather at the flagpole and stand, usually in silence, often holding up pro-peace signs. There were also some counter-demonstrations. So you began to have this phenomenon of dueling demonstrations on the Green, where the war supporters would gather and stand in one group and the anti-war students in another. There were a lot of protests at Dartmouth that were focused on ROTC. ROTC, of course, refers to the Reserve Officer Training Corps. This is the program which prepares American college students to become commissioned officers in the U.S. military after they graduate from college. Now, ROTC was not at all new in the 1960s. It dated back to World War I. But by the 1960s, because of the draft, ROTC had a very significant presence on campus. In the early 60s, before the Vietnam War ramps up, about a third of the Dartmouth student body was involved in ROTC. And the reasons for this were pretty straightforward. For one thing, ROTC provided scholarships, so it was a way to get your college partly or mostly paid for. And moreover, as I mentioned, many Dartmouth men expected to serve in the military anyway after they graduated. They figured, well, if I'm going to serve, I might as well be an officer. However, after 1965, with the escalation of the Vietnam War, ROTC becomes much more controversial. Many Dartmouth students became very critical of ROTC's presence on campus. ROTC was really visible in those days. The cadets would conduct drills on campus, as you can see in this photograph. They would be on the Green and elsewhere. ROTC was also part of the curriculum at Dartmouth because students in ROTC had to take classes on military science and military history, so there were dedicated ROTC courses in the curriculum. As the war escalated, many anti-war protesters began to see the presence of ROTC as evidence of Dartmouth's support for and participation in the U.S. war in Vietnam. And so ROTC really becomes a focus of anti-war activism. I should point out here that the opposition was not just students. There were also growing numbers of Dartmouth faculty who were critical of Dartmouth's continued participation in ROTC, given that the war, how the war was going. There were many students, it's important to acknowledge, who did want to keep ROTC on campus. These included students in ROTC and also other students, often of a conservative political inclination, who supported continued U.S. involvement in the war. So by the late 60s, these are really divisive issues. The war is a divisive issue, and ROTC is a divisive issue. One important point to make about these protests, however, just about all of this activism, both pro-war and anti-war, up until this point, it was overwhelmingly peaceful. And compared to other American universities, Dartmouth was notable for the overwhelmingly nonviolent nature of its protest activities and for the lack of any attempt by campus leaders to use violence to suppress protest. And this is an important thing, I think, for us to think about, because recently we've heard a lot of talk about how, oh, we have to suppress protests at Dartmouth because of violence elsewhere. Well, it's really important to look at what's happening at Dartmouth and to look at the history of protest and activism at Dartmouth when making those judgments, in my view. All of this is very important context for the Parkhurst Hall occupation of May 1969. The Parkhurst occupation remains probably the single most famous instance of student protest in Dartmouth history. This occupation was about the Vietnam War, but it was specifically about ROTC. For over a year prior to May of 1969, the Dartmouth faculty had been debating what to do about ROTC. As I mentioned, many faculty were critical of the war and they wanted to end the college's participation, but there were other faculty who felt differently. In January 1969, so 5 months before the Parkhurst takeover, the faculty approved a compromise proposal. Dartmouth would phase out academic credit for ROTC, so essentially take ROTC out of the curriculum, but would not outright ban ROTC from campus. This, however, did not settle the issue. During the winter and spring of 1969, there was more discussion, more debate, and more protests. And in April, the faculty did something very interesting, something that also has resonance to what's going on right now. They organized a student referendum on this issue, on ROTC. They asked 2 questions. First of all, should the faculty reconsider their earlier decision not to ban ROTC? So should we talk more about this? Secondly, if so, what course of action should Dartmouth take? There were 4 options that sort of ran the range from pro-ROTC to anti-ROTC. The first one was just to keep Dartmouth ROTC as it was currently configured, so no change. The second one was what the faculty had adopted earlier, which is you take ROTC out of the curriculum, but you keep it on campus. The third proposal was to end Dartmouth's participation in ROTC by 1973. The reason for the delay is that there were some students who were already signed up, and it was deemed to be too disruptive to them to take away their funding. So the idea was that you would phase it out over the next 4 years. And then the fourth option was to end Dartmouth's participation in ROTC immediately. There was very high participation in this referendum. We had about 90% of the students who participated. And we can see the results right here. As you can see, the student body was split over what to do about ROTC, but there are some important trends. First of all, if you look at options 3 and 4, which have to do with banning ROTC from campus, there was a majority in support of that. And there was a plurality in favor of option number 3, which is that we will ban ROTC, but we will phase it out over the next 4 years. So the faculty held another vote, and they endorsed option number 3. And the president, he has said that this is a faculty issue because ROTC is part of the curriculum, and so he agreed to go along with that decision. That vote was held on May 5th, 1969. But this did not settle the issue quite, because the next day, anti-war students took over Parkhurst Hall and occupied it. This protest was organized mainly by members of Students for a Democratic Society. Many of you will know that SDS was a nationwide organization of student activists during the 1960s. It was sort of the preeminent new leftist organization at that time. They had chapters on many college campuses. The students went into Parkhurst. They ordered all of the administrators and staff inside to leave, including the president. There were a couple of deans who tried to stay, but they were forced out of the building. The students then proceeded to barricade themselves inside the building. So they basically nailed the door shut. They were demanding the abolition of ROTC effective as soon as possible in the upcoming academic year. They also wanted an end to all military recruiting on campus. The students ended up occupying the building for about 12 hours. The occupation ended because John Sloan Dickey, as soon as the occupation began implementing a plan he had previously prepared to end it. About John Sloan Dickey. Dickey, as I expect many of you know, was a very important figure in the history of Dartmouth. It's kind of amazing to think about it now, but he was president for 25 years, from 1945 to 1970. Yeah, that's a really terrifying thing. Dickey, as you know, the Dickey Center is named for John Sloan Dickey, and I think that the reason that Dickey is remembered positively by many members of the community is he is credited with doing a lot of things for Dartmouth, with raising, first of all, the quality of the faculty, and also with raising Dartmouth's reputation for liberal arts education. Some of Dickey's policies, in hindsight, seem relatively progressive. For example, the number of black students attending Dartmouth roughly doubled during his tenure as president. In other ways, however, he was not so progressive. In the early 1960s, as many of you know, a lot of Dartmouth fraternities had explicitly racist policies that forbade them from accepting black students and other students of color as members. And at one point in the early 60s, Dickey decided this was wrong, and so he gave the frats what was described as an ultimatum. You have to rescind these policies or you will get kicked off campus. The problem was he gave them 10 years to comply with this. For Dickey, the occupation of Parkhurst was just unacceptable. The occupation did not come as a surprise, because SDS had announced its intentions in advance. It said basically that they were going to undertake civil disobedience, and everyone pretty much knew they were going to occupy Parkhurst. In part, they were inspired by the example of the occupation of Hamilton Hall that had taken place at Columbia the previous year. Dickey's use of police to arrest the protesters also did not come as a surprise. He had also effectively announced these intentions in advance publicly, and he had prepared accordingly. As soon as the occupation began, Dickey got an injunction from the New Hampshire Superior Court. He had also consulted in advance with the governors of both New Hampshire and Vermont about bringing in state police to enforce the injunction and arrest the protesters. After getting the injunction, which again arrived very quickly, the police came and read the injunction using a bullhorn. They ordered the protesters to leave. Some did, but several dozen remained inside the building. The police then waited several hours, and then finally at 3 a.m., they broke down the front door of the building. They began arresting and removing the protesters one by one. According to just about all the reports I've seen, the protesters did not resist. However, there are many reports, both at the time and in some of our oral history testimony, that the police still took it upon themselves to spray some of them with mace and otherwise treated them very violently. A total of 56 people were arrested that night, including 40 undergraduates and 2 members of the faculty. Another number that seems to have. The protesters were convicted. They were all sentenced to 30 days in prison, they were convicted not of criminal trespass, but of contempt of court for violating the injunction. And the length of the sentence, 30 days, was a surprise because normally contempt of court usually is about a 15-day sentence. So the judge really threw the book at them. In addition, the protesters were also subjected to sanctions by Dartmouth. Most of the arrested students were suspended. Some of those students eventually returned to Dartmouth, but many of them did not. Many of them ended up going and finishing their undergraduate careers elsewhere. One student was suspended. That was David Green, who's shown here as he's being led out of the building. David was a member of the class of 71. We have interviewed him for the Dartmouth Vietnam Project. It's available on our website. And David's just a wonderful guy. And for him, the Parkhurst occupation remains a really seminal event in his life. He's still very engaged with Dartmouth, even though Dartmouth kicked him out. He came back and participated in a reunion that many of the protesters had a few years ago. So I invite you to take a look at his testimony. A couple of important points to make about this episode. The first thing is that it's insufficient to explain why the protesters got arrested. The fact that they were inside Parkhurst Hall is not sufficient by itself to explain that. And we know that because 2 weeks earlier, on April 22nd, there was another sit-in that SDS, another occupation that SDS had carried out of Parkhurst. Now, that was described as a non-obstructive sit-in, and it lasted for only 3 hours. But it didn't involve any violence or arrest. It ended peacefully. The second point that's really important here is that Dickey's actions did come in for a lot of criticism. Some students criticized him for calling the police in the first place, but there was especially a great deal of criticism about the harsh punishments. I already mentioned the longer than expected jail terms, and many members of the community viewed the suspensions and the expulsion of David Green as excessive. These, I think, are important, especially when we compare Dickey's response to student protests to those of his successor. In March of 1970, Dickey retired from Dartmouth. He had actually announced his plans to retire before the Parkhurst takeover happened, so it wasn't really a result or a direct result of that. But in March of 1970, he was succeeded by John Kemeny. And Kemeny is also a really important figure in the history of Dartmouth. And there are some really interesting points of difference between him and Dickey. John Kemeny was an immigrant. He was born in Hungary in 1926. He moved to the U.S. in the late 1930s. Kemeny was also Jewish. He was actually not only the first Jewish president of Dartmouth, he was also the first Jewish president of any Ivy League institution. So he was really a pioneer in that regard. Kemeny, as many of you may know, was a brilliant mathematician. We have a building named after him that the math department is located in. And he was also a pioneer in the development of computers. He's credited with co-inventing the BASIC language, which became the key language used on early generations of PCs. Kemeny served as president from 1970 to 1981, and he really changed our institution in some profound ways. It was Kemeny who advocated for and implemented co-education in Dartmouth, and that was not a foregone conclusion in the early 1970s. There was a lot of resistance to that. Kemeny also, as you may know, rededicated Dartmouth to its original mission of education of Native American students. So in many respects, Kemeny was really a transformational president. For our purposes tonight, one of the most remarkable episodes in Kemeny tenure came right at the beginning of his presidency. In early May of 1970, almost exactly a year after the Parkhurst takeover, Dartmouth faced another crisis connected to the Vietnam War. By this point, the president in charge of the Vietnam War was Richard Nixon. Nixon had run for president in 1968, promising a plan to get out of the Vietnam War. But as president, he didn't really take steps to do that. He reduced U.S. force levels, but he actually selectively escalated the war. And in late April 1970, he announced that U.S. forces were expanding the war by invading the neighboring country of Cambodia. This provoked a massive wave of protests across the United States at colleges and elsewhere. And one of the most important actions taken in response to the Cambodian invasion was a student strike. It was the first and still the only nationwide student strike in U.S. history. These protests were also fueled by the killings of 4 students at Kent State University in Ohio by National Guardsmen who had been summoned to campus in response to anti-war demonstrations. So in this environment, Kemeny had to decide, and again, he was brand new on the job. He had been at Dartmouth for a long time, since the 1950s, but he was new to the presidency. He had heard about the plans for a student strike on Sunday, May 3rd. And the next day, he canceled all his regular meetings, and he held meetings all day with faculty and different groups of students, including the members of SDS who were leading the strike plan. He also conferred with the deans and with members of the Board of Trustees. As this is going on that Monday, May 4th, that's when the news about the Kent State massacre comes in. And by Kemeny's own account, he did not know what to do. He got a lot of conflicting advice from all sides. So that evening, he left his office around 8:30, and the way he remembers it, he was really unsure about what he was going to do. What he does is he walks over to the campus radio station. And the reason he did this is because he had started the habit of delivering a monthly radio address to the campus community. And it just so happened that that Monday was the scheduled day for his address. And he proceeded to deliver a really remarkable speech on the air. He began by reviewing many of the major political and social problems facing the United States, including growing poverty rates, racism and discrimination inflicted on Black Americans and Native Americans. He also mentioned environmental concerns. The first Earth Day had just happened, and he brought that up. And then he talked about the Kent State killings and Nixon's expansion of the war in Vietnam. And on the war, he said the following. He said, the series of actions, meaning the invasion of Cambodia, came as a great surprise to the American people, apparently as a great surprise to the Congress of the United States, and again, from all that has been said, a surprise to the government of Cambodia. In addition to that, we had to listen to arguments in favor of those actions that many of us find totally unacceptable. In this day and age, to argue we must take these acts because the United States had never lost the war is the type of argument that I, for one, simply cannot accept. Most of us have reached that stage in our thinking where we feel that war itself must be eliminated and questions of winning and losing wars have become meaningless. This is in many ways a very striking speech. First of all, it's very difficult to imagine John Dickey giving this speech. But Kemeny is very aware in the speech that what he's doing is sort of breaking the norm as a college president and coming out and taking a stand on a very controversial issue of the day. But he nonetheless defended that decision as essential in the particular moment. I want to just mention that the speech is available on the website of the Dartmouth Vietnam Project, the entire speech. The URL, I don't have it up here, is dvp.dartmouth.edu, and it's right there on the homepage, so you can read the entire document, and I commend it to you. Kemeny ended his speech by announcing that he was canceling classes at Dartmouth for the rest of the week. So he was essentially agreeing with the proposal for the student strike. He also announced that the following day, May 5th, would be a day of mourning for the students killed at Kent State. And in taking these steps, he said, I'm urging all sections of the community to participate in intensive discussions of how this community can best join hands in a united manner to take effective action. So as a result, for the rest of the week, there were no regular classes at Dartmouth. Instead, there were teach-ins and discussions, both large gatherings and small scale. This is a teaching you can see that's taking place in front of the HOP, that's the Hanover Inn in the background. And by all accounts, this was a really impressive display of leadership. Not everyone agreed with Kemeny's decisions, not by a long shot. The Manchester Union leader at this time was edited by a very conservative political figure. And when Kemeny made this announcement, he published a front page editorial which said, Dartmouth buys another lemon. Meaning that Kemeny as a new president was a lemon, like a lemon for a new car. And instantly all the students on campus started wearing lemon t-shirts. He gave Kemeny a lemon tree to put in his office. The next weekend was Green Key, and they asked Kemeny, should we have Green Key? And he says, yes, you need Green Key more than anything else this year. So the students invited him to come. There was a rock concert on Friday, and I think it was the Youngbloods. And so they invited him to come and speak. And so he gave a very short speech in which he reiterated the reasons. And then at the end of the speech, he chucked a couple of lemons out into the audience. Again, not everybody agreed with this. There were some students who didn't want to cancel classes. And there were some students who were worried about their grades, about finishing their theses and these things. But he worked out a compromise. He worked with the faculty and the students who wanted to continue their work and continue to get graded could do that. Other students who wanted to get credit but didn't want to do the work for the remainder of the semester were allowed to essentially do a pass-fail option. So throughout it all, there was no violence and no police. There was just a lot of conversation, a lot of community discussion. And I think this is very significant because this really becomes a template for future Dartmouth presidents. And as we look forward, I think Annelise is going to speak now a little bit about some of the activism that has taken place in the decades since 1970. And we can really see the lesson of John Kemeny and his approach to protest and how effective it was at that time. So let me conclude there. And
I love you guys. You're so courageous. You're so beautiful and so courageous. And I salute your morality. I salute your community. And I salute the heart that you're bringing to this campus. Thank you so much. I'm, for all kinds of obvious reasons, not going to give a super fine historical talk like my previous colleagues. I learned so much from both of your talks, and it was so wonderful to be back in I've been here a long time, and so I would like to reflect a little bit on the activism I've seen in my time here, and the students it has been my privilege to work with in a whole variety of movements that are worthy forebears, worthy successors to the movements that Ed and Julia talked about, and worthy predecessors to the movement that you have built. And when I'm done, I'd like to close by some reflections on two things: the costs of activism and something that my thesis student, Marcos, who's here, had to learn about because I'm obsessed with this sociologist, George Katsioufikis, who talks about the Eros effect, which is the feeling of electricity and love and pleasure that activism brings. And so I want to talk about those things. Really, it's beautiful. So when I first got here, there were a lot of vestiges of all these movements that Ed and Julia talked about. I was hired in the history department by one of the two faculty arrested in the Parker's takeover. So he wrote me today. I'm a good child. That was Leo Spitzer, and I also was part of a department in which Leo and his colleague Jonathan Mirsky had, at the time of the Vietnam War, sat down, and others too, I think, in front of buses holding draftees. So civil disobedience was a tradition on our campus and in our department. And the man who taught English history at that time, David Roberts, had been a protester, a conscientious objector during World War II. And we think of that as the war that nobody should have protested, but David, like my father, said, I can't shoot anyone, and I won't. The cause may be good, but I just can't do it. And he was imprisoned for that. And so his stories also gave me a sense of a Dartmouth, a history department that I was coming into that had a tradition of principle and radicalism, and I felt very honored to be part of it. And I do, again, my colleagues, the amazing statement that history made about these protests, I feel very lucky. And our chair, Cecilia Gopashkin, is here, and we really, we're going to continue to stand together. So when I first got here, the other biggest moment in Dartmouth's protest history, most famous, was the campaign against apartheid that my colleagues Goldar Nickpour and Rabig are going to talk about on Monday. But the feeling of that movement was still here. And there were students who had participated in it and been deeply affected by the shanties on the green. And I want to right now correct a statement that I believe has gone out from this president, which is that one of the reasons she brought the police in this time was because there had been violence in that protest. Melissa Zeiger and Nelson, Lizzie Blum, some of the people sitting here lived through that. But the only violence was against the students. The only violence was at the hands of the Dartmouth Review. And so I just want to say that because I feel like a lot of the coverage of your movement, of this moment, is similar in the sense that violence has been brought down on students in many campuses across this country in the last week. And again and again, right, the passive voice is used, right? There was confrontation, it got violent. So I just want to say that moment almost got violent, not because the students did it, but they occupied Baker Tower. And there was an attempt to violently remove them, but even that President McLaughlin negotiated. Right, and in the end, the violence was not called down on them, and that was something that was talked about a lot when I first got here. And it was 1990, fall of 1990. AIDS crisis was reaching a peak, and there was a lot of the beginnings of queer activism on campus. There had been queer activism before, and it had been responded to with tremendous violence by other students. One of the founders of the Dartmouth Student Gay Organization, Stuart Lewin, was locked in a closet by other students and was in this closet for several days, by some accounts almost up to a week, before he was found and released. He was traumatized in the extreme. You can see me standing up here. I feel traumatized. I know many of you do, by the events of May 1st. And I can only imagine what Stuart went through. And he finally was able to speak. It was the first senior thesis that I advised, called Degrees of Broken Silence, by Alan Drexel. And it was about the history of gay people and also coeducation for women on campus. And he interviewed Stuart. And Stuart told that story, and others who were pioneers in queer activism on campus couldn't tell the stories. There was a out queer man here in the 1940s who was beaten and ultimately died of his injuries, not on campus. But I want to give a shout out to those people, because when I arrived, queer activists on campus were very ready, and they felt safe enough to try to do the first the only action that I saw students do in my 34 years here that got them arrested. And it was an action of tremendous courage, which was to rush the football field during homecoming game. Whether we're here, we're queer, get used to it better. It was brilliant. I spoke to one of the people who did that just the other day. He called to see if I was okay, and they were arrested, but they were not. But there was caretaking even in that action that you could imagine what might have happened to a student who did that. There was caretaking for them not to be arrested violently. Right, the president was willing to have them arrested. By this time, the president was James Friedman, who I have to say I look back on with a lot of kindness and affection. I have fought with every president who's been here since I got here, but Jim Friedman, he sought to diversify the faculty. He sought to create intellectual diversity and vibrancy on campus. He was part of a group of people, including the admissions director, Carl Furstenberg, who were really committed to making the faculty, the student body, much, much, much more diverse. At the end of Friedman's presidency and into Jim Wright's, the student body would hit more than 50% students of color, and this was a conscious and a really intentional idea. A lot of hard work. So that was the first civil disobedience protest that I lived through. And unlike my colleagues who did history, the way I always tell my students to do it, which is get a good case study, go deep and get lots of details, I'm just going to give you a little sweep of these movements that I have been privileged to have students who I work with involved in. So that was the first one, the only arrests. Okay, so this idea that Parkhurst is off limits is something that was never the case. I mean, obviously, occupying Parkhurst had, those students paid a high price. But in my early years here, there were a group of women activists who were very concerned about sexual violence on campus, and they chained themselves to the banisters on the Parkhurst steps. And they made a square, and the leader of that was a student named Diana Polly, who went on to become one of the founders of the Lesbian Avengers, which I teach about in my Women in American Radicalism class. They're fun if you want to know. Anyway, Diana Polly and the students who were involved in that basically blocked the Parkhurst stairs for quite a few days, and they declared what they called the only safe space for women on campus to tell their stories. Of sexual abuse, of sexual misconduct, and they invited every woman to come and sit in that space. They said, anyone who wants to tell your story, come, sit here. This is your administration building, and we're just going to make sure that the people in it can hear what you have to say. That went on for quite a while. I didn't, have a chance to do the kind of wonderful research that Ed and Julia did, but again, this is my memoir of it. It went on for a while. There was no talk of arresting them. There were no police called in. People went past them. There was a sense that this was almost a sacred space. And it was. It really was. It was a remarkable thing. And two of the students involved in that then went on to, as I said, be some of the founders of the Lesbian Avengers, who ate fire in honor of a couple of queer folks, disabled man and his caretaker, who were killed in a firebombing, a hate bombing in Portland, Oregon. And this was, their slogan, "The fire will not consume us. We take it and make it our own." So Dartmouth, those kids in the early years that I was here, went on to be involved in many national movements. And I think what they would say to me then was, it was so hard here. It was, to be an organizer here was so frightening and so hard that going out into the rest of the country felt like they could do it. So the next time I saw Diana Polley, she was eating fire in Lafayette Park in front of the White House. So these kids, they went on and did amazing things. Sarah Pursley, who I'm not still in touch with, but I think you are, was also part of that group, and she went off and led a lesbian freedom ride in rural Idaho to get lesbians out from the rural area, make them feel comfortable. That was met with mixed response, obviously, because people who had to stay in those rural areas after the lesbian Avengers left were mixed on issues of safety. But these were some amazing early activists. And I think that this issue of sexual violence and queer freedom on campus were two that were very present in my early years here. But so again was the memory of the success of the South African divestment struggle, right? And the feeling that Dartmouth students can change the institution. And there were a series of students who were involved, including one who will come visit hopefully sometime soon, involved in campaigns to get the university to work with a group in Washington, D.C. that was created by an Evergreen student who graduated, I think, in 1983, Scott Nova. And this was an organization which tested working conditions and safety standards under which Dartmouth logo wear and other college logo wear was made around the country. And this student group was really committed to trying to get Dartmouth to divest from companies that made logo wear, exploiting their workers in conditions overseas where the workers could die making Dartmouth logo wear. And this was a long campaign for divestment from those companies and for a commitment to make logo wear in a safe and humane way. And theirs is a success story also, right? So Dartmouth can be moved on these issues. And one of the leaders of that, Allison Puglisi, is teaching at Vassar. She was going to come up this weekend to meet with you guys, but she had personal reasons she couldn't. So that's another success story. Then we get to students stand with staff, and one of the founders of that, Eric Schildiger, will be here tomorrow for general meeting of the Undergraduate Workers Union, and I hope you'll come and hear him. He's a remarkable organizer, because that's not a sexy cause, right? But there were layoffs of Dartmouth's lowest paid workers, a lot of them, right? These layoffs were sweeping campus, and the students had to understand finances very quickly and understand that you could lay off a lot of people making $35,000 a year, right? And you could cut their health care. Or you could, not bring one more mid-six-figure, administrator at the very top. And so these protests, they did two things. One is they changed the culture of the campus. And they had these mass dinners where students, staff, and faculty would just sit down to dinner. Had a lot of them in college, they sit down on the floor. They had some of them in the white church. They had some of them on the green. And it was really remarkable because, students so often, treat service workers on this campus like they don't exist, right? And so Dartmouth said, well, we're making these big cuts because we have to, meet our budget. But don't worry, we won't affect your Dartmouth experience. And so the next few days, there appeared all over campus pictures of students with the people who cleaned their dorm rooms and who served them food, and both of them were named, right? And the slogan of that movement was, "So-and-so is my Dartmouth experience." And it was a really beautiful movement. It went on for a very long time on a bunch of different levels, including, very loud protests in and around Parkhurst. And also, Eric, who you'll meet tomorrow, educated himself on how endowments work and challenged the trustees. He learned who was investing where, which trustee was making profit, from which investment, and how much money that could have saved these jobs of families who, some of them, this was their fifth generation, Upper Valley families, fifth generation of someone working at Dartmouth. right? It was the best job in the area. It was a union job. It had health care, right? And, so these layoffs, it was a very painful time, and the board claimed that, the 2008 crash had, made it necessary for Dartmouth to make these cuts in order to stay afloat. And this was me, not them, but I like to say the board at that time of the 2008 crash was not like the people who sent the world into financial crisis. They were the people who sent the world into financial crisis. So, but Eric was not, and Phoebe Gardner, who is the real deal and has been working with Cosecha, which is an undocumented workers organization in Rhode Island. Since that time, they were not put off by all of this. Jim Kim, who was then president of Dartmouth, and not our finest hour, he offered them great jobs. He said, if you just back off this, I'll write you a recommendation. You'll have a job in Washington, or you'll have a job in Geneva, wherever you want. So, needless to say, the students did not accept, and Phoebe's still working with Cosecha, and Eric is teaching middle school. It was really an honor to know and work with these students, and I still salute them. That's 2010, 2011, Occupy Dartmouth. Occupy Dartmouth, unfortunately, is what made the institution panic in 2015 and make some of these really restrictive rules that violate your and our constitutional rights to protest and free speech. The Occupy Dartmouth crew, I believe Guillermo Hernandez and Lily Brown from that are coming also to meet with you guys and talk about their experience. They were remarkable. And I will say, the college let them stay there in front of Collis on the grass for a year. And they educated anyone who wanted to talk, right? They had, they would have pots of soup cooking and chairs outside. And, Nathan Gusdorf, who was in there, was an amazing theorist, and he would talk Marx and Adorno to anyone who wanted to talk to him. Again, the cost was high. Right, I was there at homecoming the night that drunken students and parents came and kicked in the walls of the tent while they were in there sleeping, kicked them, caused real injury. Suffice it to say, none of them were sanctioned, none of them were arrested, none of them were brutalized, as we all were on May 1st. But they were a remarkable group of activists. Their chant was "Occupy Dartmouth, where Wall Street is born," and they urged students to think about other careers. Right, and to understand that if they were going to get involved in finance, to try to do so in a way that it could be put to good use. They again educated themselves in very sophisticated ways about the Dartmouth budget and the Dartmouth endowment. So the Occupy Dartmouth crew really, in many ways, changed this campus. Like I have to say that homecoming that night, with them out there on the green talking about all of those things, felt different than any other homecoming that I've been to, right? Because it was a direct, it was a direct rebuff of, some of the parts of homecoming that were most offensive, and they paid, but they're all doing fine. So Guillermo was part of a group of people that was involved in the next very visible protest against sexual misconduct and sexual violence on campus. It was a group of people, including Danny Valdez and some others, who went in to Prospective Students' Day event with fact sheets illustrating the prevalence of sexual violence on this campus. And they interrupted one of the skits, and they handed out the information to everyone who would take the sheet of paper, and they were not arrested, but they did face suspension, and they sued Dartmouth. They did a Title IX suit They got a celebrity lawyer. It didn't work out so great because the celebrity lawyer was, was not sensitive to, these were trans of color students. And, the celebrity lawyer wanted, it was a Title IX hostile environments, sexual violence suit. And, they felt like they were mistreated because they didn't look like, nice little girls for the suit, as some of the students from other institutions, I think it was Occidental in California, who joined them. However, that Title IX suit brought the Federal Department of Education Investigators Civil Rights Division to this campus. And they ran around and they took testimony. I can't say that anything big came out of it, but it was very satisfying to have the federal government on campus, asking a lot of questions that needed to be answered. And the only reason that happened is because of the persistence of those student activists. So a couple of more little anecdotes of student protest that I think are important, and then please let's open up and talk. And the next one that I wanted to talk about is the students who staged the funeral for their education, because so many faculty of color had either left because they didn't feel comfortable or they were not given tenure. And it was a remarkable event. Again, right on the Parkhurst lawn and steps, they had these coffins and these little tombstones with the names of faculty who had departed Dartmouth, and they were dropping their books, sometimes very celebrated books, into the coffin, and having a little ceremony about what their education would be like if those faculty were still at Dartmouth. By this point, it was Phil Hanlon. I disagreed with him on pretty much everything, but he wasn't bad on handling protest. Nothing happened to these students. Right? They were able to occupy that space on the Parkhurst lawn for quite some time. And then, of course, we know that the Freedom Budget students actually occupied Phil Hanlon's office. And he talked to them. That's what educators do. Educators do not call down long guns and police dogs on their students protesting. They talk to them. So those are some of the students that it has been my pleasure to know, my honor to work with, and I feel the same about all of you. I feel really honored to be, in this struggle with you. I mean, I really did just go out there. I went out there for two reasons. I went out there because I was worried that something might happen to students, and it never occurred to me in a million years that an old lady Dartmouth professor would get not just arrested, but beaten up. It just really never occurred to me. My partner, Lex, said, you could get arrested, move back. And I said, no, they don't arrest me. That'll not happen. Said they are going to arrest me. Yeah, you did. Well, one of the students who rushed homecoming that first year I was here called me and said, oh God, there's Annelise. Yeah, having a bad interaction with the police again. And this has happened so many times. What I want to say is this is a moment where there is a cost to pay. And in some of the new civil rights historiography, a lot of scholars are now trying to go into, to understand, to interview people about the cost that activists paid and the PTSD that they ended up with, right? So those folks who came back again and again, the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee protesters, and the children in the Birmingham March who had the dogs sicked on them. People had PTSD. The kids who integrated Little Rock Central High in 1957. Elizabeth Eckford, who was the one who got caught alone in that famous picture. Was spat on by an old woman she turned to for help. There's a cost, and I was giving a talk about a welfare rights book that I wrote a number of years ago at the Organization of American Historians, and the whole session was about how we have to tell our students what the cost is, because it's not fair to them if we don't. And so I'm up here answering that request by activist scholars who were there that day. Charles Payne, who wrote I've Got the Light of Freedom, one of the really magisterial books on the civil rights movement. Linda Gordon, who wrote, the big book on the history of struggle for birth control and reproductive rights. And they said, you really have to do that. So there's a cost. I have PTSD right now. I haven't slept since May 1st. Well, May 1st, yeah. If it was March 1st, it would have been worse. I haven't slept since May 1st. But this is healing. And I will never forget until I die what you guys just did. You know, when you stood for me, and I stand for you too. And I think that gets us to Eros. The Eros effect. Protesting is fun. It's really fun. And fun and your moral authority is why it spreads, because you're on the right side of history, like all those students that we saw in the presentations that Ed and Julia made, and the students that I just talked about. And the students all across the country who are doing the same thing right now that you are doing. And, as bad as what happened to us was, what happened to Columbia the night before and what happened at UCLA the night after were even worse. One should know, we should know, that there was a coordinated effort in New Hampshire the night that they brought armed police onto this campus, and that those same riot police SWAT teams were brought into the University of New Hampshire. And I was reached out to by a professor there. I want to say another Jewish professor who also felt like he needed to be standing between his students and the police. And he said, they brought long guns in here. They brought police dogs in here that night. They brought machine guns to the University of New Hampshire. And it was just utterly, utterly terrifying, in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. This Jewish professor feels less safe on this campus than I've ever felt in my 34 years here. You're my community, and it's outrageous. And I hope you'll read also, along with the history department statement, a brilliant letter written by my colleague Udi Greenberg, who's Israeli, and who says, it's not abstract to me, in which a bunch of Jewish faculty, myself included, signed the letter saying, don't you dare speak for us. Don't you dare say you're defending us and bring violence into this place. So that's it, and let's get up here and talk to you guys. And I really want to hear your stories. I've been talking to a lot of traumatized students over the last couple of days, and I know students got hurt too. And I know that students are not sleeping, and people are not eating, and they're scared. And let's talk, because we all need it. So. Yes, we have microphones.
Yes. So you can raise your hand and the microphone will be delivered to you.
Yes, it will magically appear. Yeah, I want to hear from you guys. I need to hear from you guys. Tell me your stories. Tell me what you're feeling. Oh, this is the moment. Oh, when people leave. Okay. I hope some of you will stay and talk and ask questions or make statements or tell us how you feel. Nobody's talking?
I'll break the ice.
Thank you. Thank you, Golnar.
Yeah, thank you.
Another activist scholar.
I just want to say this is just an awesome panel. Thank you guys so much. And Annelise, thank you for all of us. Really a model of how to do this. We appreciate it so much. But Let me just ask a question. We've been talking about Dartmouth a lot tonight, and obviously the context for what's happening on Dartmouth right now is national, it's international. There's student protests all over the world happening on behalf of, to end this war in Gaza, or for broader sort of end of the occupation of Palestine. And I wonder, we have university presidents. I've been thinking about this a lot because I've seen this movement grow over the course of 20 years, and I've written about it, the sort of divestment movement. But I'm still struggling to put together some of the pieces of what I think the inputs are for the response, the sort of outside response on campuses, and especially for those of you who have sort of longer standing histories of looking at these movements. Like, we have university presidents being called in before Congress. There's obviously an extremely hostile sort of far-right movement in this country that's hostile to sort of history education or sort of broader liberal arts education altogether. But there's also movements, there's long-standing movements sort of against any effort to say Palestine, right? So we talk about that in Annelise studies as the Palestine exception. And these are not exactly like movements in the sense that they're not always exactly the same people, but they clearly also, there's also clearly, like in Julia's outside agitators sort of model, there's also outside forces on right-wing movements too. Those are also social movements, right? So I wonder if you can just, like, why? Like, it's something we're all thinking about, right? Like, why did this happen? Why was the response so outsized? How much do you see it as a kind of internal logic? How much do you see it as an external logic to when police are called, when they're not called? Who's the audience for all this, right? Who is supposed to be, like, pleased with this response? So I just wonder if you could speak to that based on your sort of understanding of these social movements further back.
Do you guys want to?
Well, I'll just offer a couple of thoughts. I think, first of all, as far as right-wing social movements, I think our colleague and your partner, Jeff Charlotte, has done great work documenting these, and especially in recent years, and sort of showing where those movements come from and the logic behind them. I think another really important thing, it's sort of obvious, but it's getting very little attention in the media, is just the use of violence by government authorities in the last few years has increased a lot, right? And especially in the Trump administration, he called out at one point the 82nd Airborne, right, on Black Lives Matter protesters. And that's a change, right? It's not that there hadn't been use of force to suppress protesters before, but the use of a really hardcore military force like that. And I think what we're seeing, at the time, there was some resistance to it, actually within the government apparatus, actually within the U.S. military. But I think what we're seeing now is a normalization of that, and there's a higher tolerance for it. I don't think that's a complete answer, but I think that's part of what we're seeing now.
I think Black Lives Matter is crucial, and that's actually the movement on campus that I didn't talk about, but I should, because they occupied the library. They marched through the library. They didn't occupy the library because then they knew they were going to get arrested and they were nervous. But they marched through the library, and it's not that they didn't take a lot of flack for that, because they were filmed by Dartmouth Review students who then broadcast the videos of them all around the world. And these poor Dartmouth protesters would find their pictures in papers in London, and on TV clips in right-wing media all around the world. So I do think, but those protests, the summer after George Floyd's murder, I read one statistic that 1 in 12 American families had a kid out there. That's enormous, right? And the protests went on for months, and they were young, right? Which means that's the future, and it's your generation, right? It's your generation that did this, and it's and I think there was a lot of fear. There was unbelievable violence. And there was, and that violence started with Occupy Wall Street. The same legal observers who were out there with you guys the other night, National Lawyers Guild documented, police on motorcycles driving over the hand of, of an old woman legal observer, and the beatings and violence that was used against the protesters in the summer of 2020 was astonishing. A very good friend's son was arrested in Lafayette Park. It was the middle of the COVID epidemic, and they put them all in an airless trailer for the night, made them stand up, still handcuffed, and ripped their masks off. Right, so they were all in this place together. So someone else, another young woman who's really part of the family was out there, and there were rubber bullets in people's faces. She was picking rubber bullets out of people's lips. So this violence is not new. But I also think it's part of this 40-year right-wing attempt to take over education. Because, there's a feeling that that's the problem. Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, said it the other day, professors are the outside agitators in his view, right? That one professor, he said, can poison the minds of 50 students at a time, and they know how to talk. So
you have 3 professors.
So here's to that. But I think it's time to negate both book bans, right? And now they're having anti-Semitism hearings in Washington, for public school teachers, right? Anti-Semitism is the new McCarthyism, and so it's a perfect storm because there's the Palestine exception that Golnar is talking about. Otherwise liberal people who are, stand probably have fairly similar politics to many of us, but on Israel won't. Right, on Israel won't. And so it's a perfect storm with them, with this 40-year campaign to take over higher ed. And as far as college administrators, I don't know. I mean, that's what we were trying to say. You're not going to go around go around beating up your students and faculty. Right, that's new, but that is where we are. A couple of people have said, and I think this is true, that it's almost the mirror image of the obscenely disproportionate response that Israel is leveling on Gaza, right? It is almost that disproportionate violence that protesters are experiencing on campus. Anyway, I've talked enough. You guys.
We have another one. I just want to preface, is this also being recorded, the Q&A? Okay. Okay, that makes us uncomfortable, but I'm gonna do it anyway. My name is Cora. I am not a Dartmouth student. I don't work here. I don't go here. I work at Vermont Law Graduate School. I was among the arrested on Wednesday. And knowing that this is recorded especially, I'll share that my field of study and expertise is restorative justice. And what has come to mind this entire time, and especially Wednesday, is the South African proverb on which restorative justice stands, which is Ubuntu. I am because you are, because we are. And I will say what I have to say anyway, knowing that I'm admitting that I was arrested to my employers who don't potentially know that yet. Because it's only a matter of time, I suppose. I am interested in having a conversation about how we're doing. It makes me emotional to listen to you, Annelise, get up there and say, you haven't slept. Because I haven't. No. And I'm not eating either. No. And part of me feels like I shouldn't or can't talk about that I can't admit it. Partially because I had privilege to leverage, and I still do, and I recognize that. And partially because admitting that means that I was there and welcomes the punishment and retribution from the institution I work for and my legal education and my career moving forward. And I also know that that's what restorative justice is, and it's talking about the things that make us vulnerable, the things that we have in common, and the things that we don't. So I want to know how other people are doing, and the resources you're seeking out, if any. I've found a lot of the aftercare sessions to be really helpful and sweet. Got props to the people who are organizing those time and time again. I went to the one after the Baker One rally most recently, and I didn't anticipate going, and I went, and it was incredibly powerful just to look people in the eye and for people to say, how are you? Are you doing okay? And to look at each other and ask that question. So that's my question, both to you, Annelise, and anybody else in this room who was there, whether you were carried away in a van or not.
I want to salute your courage. Your courage is amazing. You've heard from me, you know how I'm doing. How are the rest of you doing? Would you say not great? Yeah. Say, yes, speak. Is there a mic?
Let's see. All right, it's true about that walking. So hi, I'm Martha, also one of the rescues. Don't worry. I mean, the type of violence that happened, I think, is like so crazy because it was really just like, to some degree, indiscriminate of like, they don't know what they're looking for, but you know, they'll write that up the morning later. So I think that part of, I guess, what I find like traumatic is that it's not just the violence of like being arrested and the ways in which that was made a public spectacle for by lots of intents and purposes, but also the way it's made a spectacle every single time she's talked about it, the way she's minimized it of like just police on campus. They weren't just police on campus, there were police in riot gear, there were police who were instructed and green lighted to hurt us if they felt like that's okay. I'm so sorry.
No, let it out. I'm crying. I cried so many times today.
So you're just really, it's just one of those things that comes in waves of, you know, understanding what's happening on other campuses can get even more violent, but also recognizing what happened here was bad.
It was violent.
And there's nothing that happens on another campus that can take away or excuse or validate or justify what happened here. And I think also it's important to note that people have to make a decision about how they feel about police. They have to, and I feel that when Black Lives Matter happened and that conversation was floated back up, people felt like they didn't have to make the conversation about police themselves, right? It was okay to say that Black people don't deserve to be violated, but questioning police as an institution was not on the table. Particularly because it just seems like time and time again, this power that police have, the funding that police have is insane and disproportionate to everything. And I think I just fail to see how it would benefit society if we had this type of response to any and every instance of dissent, and what type of society would develop out of that. I guess to personalize it, how I'm doing. A lot of people have been kind, and I want to feel grateful for that. But at the same time, I think about the institution, right? By Luck, on her own words, right, says that she expected violence to a large degree, and thus police were on campus. But when I talk to student accessibility services who helps disabled students like myself navigate this campus, they don't have any resources to support people who may have been mentally impacted by this event. They don't have any resources for counselors who specialize within, you know, anti-Semitism responses or Islamophobic responses. And this notion that she cares for us, but only through police violence, it's just a flat out lie. And I want to encourage people who haven't yet voted in the referendum, please vote no confidence. If there has to be an outside agitator in this narrative, for the love of God, it's by Luck.
Other people want to say anyone else want to talk about how you're doing?
I'm an international student, so it doesn't matter where I was at that time or what I was doing. But I just want to say I think this is the field that you mentioned, is about how much love and solidarity that we all developed at that night. People who were there, who I saw, who I just seen around on campus, people who were my close friends, people who were my friends, but maybe we weren't that close. At that moment, I think there was just like something there where all of us just wanted to give ourselves for others. It didn't matter who was getting arrested. It was that I would get, like, everyone wanted to protect each other. Everyone wanted to take care of each other, regardless of who it was, whether we knew them or not. And I think that is something that also makes us like stand out, and which is the reason why all of us, like, even after getting arrested, after all the drama that everyone went through, we got together after that. We took care of each other after that. We were able to work through it and are still standing so strong regardless of all the violence that has been happening on this campus since fall term. And I just want to acknowledge, and I want everyone that I know Dartmouth is a very conservative vibe space where we feel like everyone is against us, or people don't care, or they're so apathetic, or that we don't have friends. But I think it's such a sweet feeling that there are so many people who are willing to get arrested, who are willing to put themselves on the line for people who are so far off in Gaza that they've never met. And I just want people to not forget that as well.
Yeah. I just wanted to apologize if I came off saying that, we didn't have it so bad. I didn't mean that. I was just so horrified by what happened to the students on the UCLA campus.
I also told myself that at the beginning, just to feel better. Like, oh, well, I'm back home. Next day, it was gone. The shock, I was over it.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing I want to say, that I had a lot of injuries that night, and it took a week, 8 days really to stop hurting, just for my body to stop hurting so much. And when my body stopped hurting so much, the PTSD symptoms started, and they're much worse than they were when my body was hurting. So it's going to take time, and taking care of each other is definitely what we have to do. And I agree with you. That's the Eros effect, right? We have family. That's what the students and I in our little cell for those hours were saying. Like, we have a new family now, and and that's the bond. One of the students was in one of my classes. Like, this is a new kind of professor-student. So don't let anybody take away that bond. It's real. It's real. And even if we're in the minority on this campus, there's a lot of us. There's a lot of us. And I want to, I just want to call out my friend Lizzie Blum, sitting in the second row, who's been doing this since Mississippi in 1965.
In Berkeley in 1964 at the Free Speech.
All right.
800 of us got arrested.
Oh my God. Oh my God. You want to tell that story? Okay. But Lizzie is proof that you can survive all these years and stay in the struggle and garden, and she still can out cross country ski me and like most other people. So joy, right? Joy will get you.
It's very energizing. Organizing is energizing.
Yeah.
And you get energized by it, and it builds community. The thing to me that's important, it builds a community. It did during the divestment and the apartheid here, and it did during Occupy, and it is building an incredible community now. And thank you, Kevin and Rome, to start.
Yeah.
A beloved community.
Yes, I know. That was It's what I said at the end of the editorial. Beloved community is everything, right? We have to rebuild it, and we have it, and we're lucky, very lucky. Anybody else want to talk about recovery or, yeah?
Hello.
Hi.
Two of the people upstairs have been my professors. I think Eric Adams, and then like Professor Earl, we were in the same band together.
I remember.
And then I think about like a lot of the time.
Professor student bonding on the way to jail.
We were thinking about like May 1st. I was always thinking about how we were singing like Walking on Sunshine for 10 minutes straight to Lebanon. And I remember people who like came after us to Lebanon were like, oh, are you guys the first bus? Y'all were so annoying. Because I think some of the people who were like in our band were just like so silent, and other buses of students came in, and I think the cops told them like, can you not sing? Because we have something like that. So then, and then I knew that when we were in our cell together, we were like, oh, we should start an a cappella group. Oh, like we should like fun out of this, because honestly this is like fun for life. But I really appreciate that you were there, and I think that at the time I didn't know you were a professor. I think I just saw that there were so many community members that were there with us, because I think at the time in the bus, it was like 2 to 4 Dartmouth students, and we all really didn't know each other, so we were just like freaking out because we were the first 9 that got taken from the circle. And I think about that a lot. And all those like sentiments about like not being able to sleep, not being able to eat, I think that for many days now I forget what time to eat, and I don't remember what time of day is today. And I'm always like, oh, today's Friday. It doesn't feel like a Friday. It still feels like last week for me. So I think that a lot of it is very, like, I'm processing it, and I'm someone from a city, so I often have seen police violence, and so, as someone from Philadelphia, I've lost a lot of my friends to police violence, so I'm still very desensitized to May 1st, because to me, it's like, oh, this is something that was very normal to me, and coming to Dartmouth, seeing all that, I was like, oh, shit, it's gonna go down, like, in a city way. So I think that that's kind of my feeling about it. Like, I'm very desensitized, and I think, for me, I'm still trying to process and trying to understand how I personally feel getting arrested off the green. But really appreciate all 3 of you guys for like the presentation, because I think for a lot of us who are scholars and we have learned so much from your classes and did so much of your readings, when I left jail, my face was held high, I cheered when I left jail, and then I remember when all the Dartmouth students left first, we told you guys, because you guys were cross and community members, that, oh, we'll wait outside for you until everyone's bailed out. So I think that that's something that I really appreciated, the community that we had built. I didn't know anyone, but we were just like, we'll wait for you. And then we all left like jail around like 2 in the morning that day. So just like really appreciated, I think, for a lot of us here to recognize that this is something that's very consistent with like a lot of this institutional history. And as someone who's like, I'm waiting in 20, 30 years where Dartmouth will apologize to me. And like, I'm waiting for the letter. And honestly, like, and then like, I'm waiting for like someone from 20 years later gonna like email me for an interview. I'm like so here for, so I just want to see myself in the library archives. I think that's like my shout to fame and purpose, and I think that's something that I'm very excited for. But I think like really shout out to so many people who were there that night. And I really want to emphasize people who were like, I remember someone who was like walking down the street by the green, and I just saw her and she started crying, and then she ran towards and joined the circle. And I think that this is a moment where like the tide has shifted at Dartmouth. And I think that even people who are more lay observers, people who don't really like, oh, this is none of my business, and I will try to be complicit or be neutral on a moving train, has reached out to me and many of our friends to be like, that was not okay, that was unacceptable. And I think this is something that we had. It's the first time this referendum since like the last 60s when we did a referendum about replay. So I'm very excited to see how the vote will turn out next week. But just really appreciate everyone here. And like the 2 talks, you guys have influenced me so much around like radical history, and like just know that maybe Mayor Eric Adams is correct. Maybe I am poisoned by the institution. But yeah, really thank you guys. I really appreciate it, and just want everyone to know that we are all in this together. We will win at the end of the day. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Ali Morales. I'm one of the co-founders, along with many of my colleagues in this region, of the Student Workers Collective. My opinion is from our labor union. We were also arrested on the night of May 1st. I, for one, was arrested. I wasn't initially supposed to be arrested. I was out in the sort of the front of the protesters, looking at the people who were on the circle, and I was actually in the front when I watched you, Professor Orleck, get brutalized by police. And a lot of us and the people right next to me started screaming, and we just felt so much rage. And I believe he's a grad student, but one of the people in the circle just said, "Don't resist, it's not worth it," etc. And you know, I thought about, in that moment, I thought a lot about how did this happen, and especially about sort of the unexpected, quote unquote, presence of the police on this campus. And I thought back to October, when it should have been expected that police were going to be on this campus, because they were on this campus when 2 of our members also got arrested, and when, for the large part in that moment, campus stayed silent and didn't react to that police presence. So in a sense, it could have been a bit expected. And then I also got really angry because I thought, well, what do you mean don't resist and don't do anything? What am I supposed to do? And that's sort of the moment that I said, well, you know what? I'm in this with you guys, and if they can arrest the professor, they can also arrest me. But I guess I want to talk a little bit about how that's affected me in the past week, in the sense that May 1st was also Labor Day, and that day started with Gold UE going on strike for various different reasons. But one of them was, I believe, for the first time in the nation, directly also coinciding with the events in Palestine because of their Palestine Solidarity Caucus. And at the SWCD, we woke up early that morning because we were going to refuse for a contract to cross picket lines and to show our solidarity with our leaders. And the events that led before the encampment at 5 p.m. was also the Labor for Palestine rally. And I guess that whole day in general has got me thinking about, you know, there's this institution in front of us that can take away so many things from us. And in a sense, it almost feels like we as individuals can't really take much away from it. But if anything, over the past week has shown is that one thing we can take away is what we'll always proudly wear, which is our labor, and the ability to take away the things that this institution benefits from. So, you know, I was really inspired by the faculty walkout the day after. I wasn't able to attend because our unit, our batch of people got back around 4 a.m. So a lot of actually trying to catch up on sleep. But I just want people to remember what they can do with their labor, and with things like a walkout, and with the ability to just say no to an institution, to say no, we won't give you sort of that, we won't let you extract this from us. And that is what voicing. And also, just the last word is, you know, there is a group of people out there still picketing every day on the green, and they are picketing for us as well. The aggregation to go to the Gold website accepting donations.
People are starting to leave, but I know Rowan had a hand up and Lizzie did, and if anybody else has last words.
I just want to say thank you so much for having this ability to really value our history and what the past struggles on campus. And I feel it feels like the activist community is almost like this bubble that we're grounded in this past history of Dartmouth, where a lot of the rest of campus feels very so I guess just one house to do this again in the fall, so we can rapidise the 28th.
Well, but we're doing it again on Monday. Golnar and Ravi are going to be doing one on Monday, so keep it going.
We have to change it. Tuesday, 7 p.m. We don't know the space yet because
just booking your things. Where? Probably just across the hall. We'll send out information. That one's going to be about Global South Solidarity and student movements. I'm talking about please come. Yeah.
We were very grounded in history and activism and the day after, Friday Walker received an email quoting a passage from the Dartmouth video justifying our arrest by saying that we have threatened physical action, when that was a quote from the freedom budget 10 years earlier. And so I feel like I really appreciate how you guys put it in context of how other prisoners have reacted, because even when using the same language of past protest movements, we have been viewed as violent when, as we all know, we're the ones who've been inflicted with violence from the police. Yeah. I think, I really appreciate you talking so much about the long-term of organizing work, especially when this work inherently has to engage in disobedience, which will get punished in some way. But I had PTSD before I got arrested, and that was in large part partially due to the first time I had cops called on me, which was because I was homeless. And I think that feels like another divide where, I felt like the low-income working class community was disproportionately represented amongst those who had been arrested. And it was Jim Henning who wrote an amazing article where he said, if these students had had their last names on a building, would the prison have called them all the time? Answer probably no. But I think knowing that these are long-term impacts, and knowing that they are disabling PTSD is something that can go. I don't know how, as an organizer, I can best advise new generations of activists of how to engage. And I guess there's a level of guilt there, but I guess do you guys have any advice on how to best support people who want to do this work, need to do this work, but kind of having that, being able to kind of see the future and dream that for people. And I guess on that note as well as having to have conversations with people who don't understand it. Like, I feel like so often when I've been trying to talk to like administrators or student government and professors who aren't necessarily been involved, there's this complete lack of understanding about the actual violence that is imposed on people, because it's like a long-term form of psychological torture. And I just don't know how to communicate that well.
After 60 years, Liz, do you have any advice?
Organize and join a union. And I think that partly this movement started last year with all of the undergraduate and graduate union organizing, and I really want to call out the organizers for the fantastic work you've done.
You guys are in it. You helped organize that union.
Well, pretty much some of you go on to be union organizers, because that's something that's happening all around the country. And remember Annelise's book, we are all fast food workers now.
All right, it's getting late, but if anybody else wants to talk and we close up. Oh yeah, we have one more.
Sorry, the mic's right behind you.
Hi, I'm one of the outside agitators. very inspiring to get to know everybody here, to get to know the students. I'm absolutely in awe of this generation, I must say.
Me too. I love Gen Z.
I first got involved with these guys in the court case and started showing up. And Annelise, I just saw you on Democracy Now! I'm glad to meet you in person. I was teaching Middle Eastern dance while you guys were out there. I felt bad during my teaching. I went out to check on my friends who I thought were in the tents, only to find this horror show of a charged atmosphere. And later to find out that, you know, another outside agitator was my 83-year-old neighbor who's blind. And he got arrested. And then, and then to read in the Valley News that a guy who was a resident here, who was visiting, didn't even know what was happening, had his shoulder broken. When he had, I mean, so I wrote a letter to President Baylock, and said, you know, what are you doing? I've lived here for 50 years. This is the first time in 50 years I've ever felt like we live here because we're calm, we're peaceful, we take care of people, we don't throw people on the ground. This is not New York City. And by the way, you know, you do research on student anxiety. What? Yeah. So then I wrote a subset of the letter, and it was published in the Valley News today, next to another letter that said, you didn't get really hurt, did you? I could not believe what I saw. But I will tell you, as somebody who's lived here for a long time, she changed the Upper Valley for me. And I said, look, you owe us an apology. These people who live in this community hold up the school. They're your workers. You do not want to offend them. And the others of us who are here. You know, get in step. Look at UVM. They did better. Middlebury, my alma mater, they did better. Yeah, they did. They did much better.
Kevin.
We love Kevin.
Yeah,
Very briefly, thank you all for organizing this and for all of you for putting so much love and care into this space, especially in a time when it can be very isolating. So thank you. And then also I wanted to echo something that Lynn said, which is that the tide is turning. When I was researching Occupy Dartmouth, there's like an interview where they're talking about Palestine. It's one of the issues that they're looking to elevate youth education. And we're looking at pictures of anti-apartheid movements. We're seeing, even though they're in black and white, we're seeing people there with kefiyehs like the one you're in now. And so I just want to say that that investment will happen and Palestine will be free.
Hi everyone, my name is Serena. I'm really honored to be a student of Professor Orleck's. She's really taught me so much about social rights history and civil rights history and the world. And I think I owe so much of who I am today as a historian to her. I really appreciate it. It's been a huge honor to also be standing alongside Rowan and Kevin. The courage that you guys have displayed over the past how many months since that arrest is just you both inspire me and everyone who's been arrested. Thank you. I'm really honored to be sharing this space with you. But I think something that has been echoed, and I really appreciate all the professors bringing it up in their presentations and in discussions and different points from different members here, is that like Kevin said, the tide's turning, and I think something, I'm also in Professor Ansfield's Histories of the Carceral State class this time, and it's really been powerful to understand the apparatus of how the state that we live in has been built, really from the ground up. But I think something that has really stuck with me is looking then as a student of history at Black Lives Matter, at anti-Vietnam, at anti-South African apartheid, all these other different movements, the civil rights movement. It feels like we've been growing up and everyone says that they put a lot of trust and faith into our generation. But I really, I guess, want to ask all the history professors here and other historians, anyone else in the room, it does feel like this is everyone says that on the right is Palestine will free all of us. And it feels like this really is not just a tide-turning moment, not just for Palestine, but for collective liberation, that this is when we will see like true like liberation, for Black liberation, Jewish liberation, all these struggles are all united together. And I think, I just, from your perspective, I've tried to wrap my head around this over the past how many months of just, this doesn't feel like the others. And I say this as someone who's, of course, like Black Lives Matter supporter, all these different other movements that I've also been a part of, different climate justice movements, but this feels like something that can really connect all of us. And I'm just wondering if there's ever been any other moment in history where you've seen something like this that can really bring everyone together. We all have a struggle that's somewhere linked in this country that somehow Palestine wants to solve. So I wanted to pose this to anyone or to professors as well. Thank you.
I don't know, but I think, I mean, there have been moments of mass protest. I think this is obviously, I've said this, the moral issue of our time. There are many, but this one is the one that has galvanized this amazing movement. And I think it is tied to labor, and I don't think it's accidental that, you know, Gen Z also has practically brought the labor movement back from the dead in this country. So I have tremendous respect. And I think you don't bring out the big guns if you think you're winning. So that's terrifying, but it's true. And it's my honor to work with you, Serena. Probably 9:30. Yeah, we should call it. Thank you.